Hello everyone, welcome back. I can see we're just about halfway through the mini conference at the moment. I'm just about to hand over. We're already started on YouTube. For those people who are following the YouTube, there is about a 2 or 3 minutes delay. And I would like to thank the special little room up in Queensland, the 4 government departments up there that are giving me the feedback. Thank you very much. It's been very helpful for the YouTube side. So I'll now pass over to Warwick, who will now pass over to then David. Then after that we will have question time, and it is quite possible that we have to vacate this room at 12, but we actually have another room booked with a teleconference, so if there are continuing questions, there might be a short 5-minute break and we will resume in the other room with the teleconference, as well as the people here who want to talk to the presenters. So over to you, Warwick.
Okay, thank you, Tony. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor David Skillicorn. You can see many of his details up there on the screen, but I've known David now for many years. I can't remember when we first met, but it was quite some time ago. David is an Australian. I'm not certain how long he's been living in Canada, but I know it's been quite some time. And he has also, while he's been there, has gained a reputation for being an expert in the area of what we would call counter-terrorism, using data science for detecting those who are threats, and from that point of view. And this presentation, I believe, will probably address some of those issues that David's become quite famous for.
Thank you, Warren. Hello everyone, I hope you can hear and understand my Hawaiian accent, halfway between Australia and Canada. As you see, I come from Queensland, Canada, but I'm here at UTS until the end of July, and I would be delighted to work with any of you who have problems that you're concerned about that fit into the space that I work in. So just let me start with the commercial. These are the kinds of things that we work on in my lab. So this is adversarial analytics, and many of you are aware that once you get into the adversarial space, you have to rethink the way you do analytics, because you have to worry about the fact that there are people on the other side who are actively trying to subvert the kind of analytics that you're going to do, and therefore you have to be a bit careful about not being sucked into that kind of subversion. And so there are sort of some strategic approaches to that problem, and the first and the most obvious one is that you have a long list of bad things that you're going to look for. And many organizations know how to do that. Auditors, for example, and then the sort of meta-level benefits-level approaches that try and find numbers which are not naturally created numbers, and so on and so on. But the problem with that is that the bad guys are always looking for ways to come up with things you haven't already thought of. And so if you just follow that approach, then you're going to be caught by new things that you didn't think of, and you have to continue to be trying to be cleverer than the adversaries, but in some ways their incentives are stronger than yours are. So the other kind of meta approach is to say, well, I'm going to look for things which are outliers in some sense in the data, because that's where I expect the bad things to be, because often it's plausible that normal is equal to good, at least roughly speaking. So things which are not normal tend to be either bad or weird. And so your problem reduces to try to distinguish the bad things from the weird things. And because adversaries know that you're looking for them, they're mostly going to try and make sure that they're not too unusual compared to normality. They probably can't quite be normal, but they're also going to work quite hard not to be very, very far from normal. And so in some philosophical sense, you get this big cluster of normality, and then way, way out you get all the weirdness, and just around the outside of the cluster of normality is where you expect to find the things that bad guys are doing. And this is going to work best when the data you're collecting is data where it's hard for them to manipulate where they will sit in your analytics. And that drives you towards places where humans don't control the data they generate very well. And there's sort of 3 places where that happens. One is language, which I'm going to talk about in much more detail in this talk. The second one is the social network space. If you're a sleeper group of terrorists somewhere, then the question, how many friends should I have on Facebook, is actually a very hard one to answer. And the more you think about it, the harder that question gets. So it's not something you can kind of creep up on. And so that's a strategy which is used in many situations to pick out people who are unusual. And it's a very hard one for adversaries to handle because they don't really know the global picture. And so they have to guess what will make them seem normal. And then the third one is behaviors. And this is very productive because if you tell somebody to act more naturally, then the effect is that they'll act less naturally, unless they're a very good actor, and most people are highly paid and don't usually have much interest in criminality and terrorism. And so there's a lot, this is the part that's the most untouched, because it's not so easy to collect data about behaviors, but it's also probably in the long run the most fertile. So I've written purpose tremor there. The next time you go and stick a key into a lock that you use all the time, because I've mentioned this, you will fail to insert it cleanly, even though you usually do. And that's, if you think about it, quite a hard physical task. So the more you try and think about inserting a key into a lock smoothly, the less you'll succeed at doing that. And that's one of the problems we have as humans, right? We can't control our behavior, and the more we want to, the less we actually succeed. So there's a lot of science still to do. It's surprising how little is understood about human language and human behavior, in fact, but there's lots of applied work that gets done in my lab as well. So I want to talk about language today, and I'm hoping that at the end of the talk you will go away saying, wow, I didn't know we could do that, and I think I see how we might be able to use that in our space, or just maybe we should be much more careful about the things we put out there because other people might. So if you ask people how language works, they usually come up with some sort of picture like this. Right? There's an idea you have in your mind, and it passes through a number of states on the way to the actual utterance or writing that you produce. And so it starts off as an idea, and if you're bilingual, at some point during the process you commit to the language you're going to say at the end, and there's a branch, and so on. But it's all very nice and linear. And really, that's not at all what happens. So it's much more realistic to imagine that process is bouncing around your brain for a relatively long time. And so on the path from idea to utterance, something visits lots of different parts of your brain, which means that the actual form in which the utterance pops out has been affected by lots of different parts of what's going on in your mind at the time. And so you're constrained by the idea that you're trying to express, obviously, but also a lot of social processes. Some things you cannot say in some languages, some things you cannot say in some contexts. So people, for example, who use a lot of swear words can usually turn that off when they're in certain situations without even being conscious that they're doing that. And because it visits so many parts of your brain, it actually captures an awful lot of your mental state along the way. So that's the key insight, which says, if I can understand it properly, I can use people's utterances to figure out what's going on inside their heads, at least at some level. Now, it's helpful practically to think about this as happening in two simultaneous the line and the pegs, and the content channel. Quite separate. Content channel is the stuff that nouns and so on that we use. And it's the stuff that we perceive consciously when somebody speaks to us or when we read something that they write. The internal state channel, on the other hand, flies below the radar, both for the speaker and the hearer. It's almost half of everything you say or write, but it's only a tiny fraction of all the possible words that you could use. And mostly it's the very, very short words. And we're effectively blind to those words. We use them, half of what we say uses those words, but we have no control, no conscious control over how those words get used. And so that means that there can be a very useful channel to see what's going on inside people's minds, because it's hard for them to manipulate. In fact, we're so blind to that channel that it wasn't even realized that there was such a thing until relatively recently. So here's an example of what I mean by those two different channels. Suppose you're sitting at a meal with somebody and the salt is down the other end of the table and you want them to pass the salt to you. Well, the content channel is basically this action that I want that person there to pass me the salt. But the list on the bottom gives you a number of different ways in which that could be expressed, all of which are basically identical in the content channel, arranged to get the salt to me, but which carry with them very, very different impressions about the person who's doing the asking. And that's the kind of thing that I mean, right? The internal state channel is what differentiates between those possibilities there, which allows you to make some guess about the relationship status that's going on, the mood this person might be in, and all sorts of other things. Now there's a complicating factor, and that's verbal mimicry. It turns out that we copy the patterns of people we interact with very, very quickly and very, very closely. So if you want to look at a conversation, it's actually quite hard to pick up which pieces are coming from which mind, because we copy each other so well. And so I'll come back to some of the issues that raises. But just as the practical application, if you're interested in interrogation, you really, really have to think about mimicry as something to take into account. And I have a friend who's an RCMP officer, and his conclusion basically is if you want to put people in interrogation, all that he says to them is, what would you like to tell me? And that's enough often for them to just start talking, and after they talk for a while, they start confessing and mentioning things they'd rather not. So if we believe that mental state leaks out in language, then what are we going to do to actually leverage that? Well, the forward engineering problem is, let's figure out the mechanism. What are the signals that reveal certain kinds of mental states in language? And we've done that, not just me, but lots of other people, for language models of things like deception, telling conscious lies, financial fraud, influence, jihadist intensity, and so on and so on. And I'll show you some examples of these as I go along. And all of these models were built empirically. So basically you find some situation where you have speeches or documents of one kind and speeches or documents of the other kind, and you sit down and you say, what's different between these two kinds of documents? And from that, you build your model. Now you might say, well, okay, but we should really have done it the other way around. We should think about what happens when people tell lies, say, and build the language model from that. And the trouble is it doesn't work, because the intuitive ideas we have about what happens when somebody is exy, use some sort of particular language model, are just not reliable. And those of you in the law enforcement space will be aware that deception's been studied for a long time, and you can find a theory and its opposite in almost every aspect of that process, right? So people who are telling lies are unusually still. People who are telling lies are unusually fidgety. No, well, yeah, there's a whole lot of those kinds of pairs that people believe or not. So once you have such an empirical model, then you can take a bunch of documents, let's say, and you can rank those documents so that they're ranked from the most deceptive to the least deceptive, the most gamified to the least gamified, and so on. Right? So you can use the knowledge of how this process works to categorize people's utterances by how strongly that property comes through. And if you can do that, then in many situations where there's a huge pile of documents, so online data, e-discovery in law and stuff like that, you can say, well, point me to the documents that a human needs to read, those ones where this property is the strongest or maybe the weakest. And the rest of them you can be fairly confident are not going to be very interesting for the purposes of whatever it is you're looking at. And then you can ask other questions like, well, what does this tell us about how humans behave when they're carrying out this kind of a process? So let me walk through a couple of examples of that and show you how it plays out. So deception is actually really hard for humans to detect directly. You can sort of see why that would be. If genetically, if there was somebody who was really good at detecting deception, that would be a great survival advantage and it would spread through populations. And so we're in a kind of stalemate with both being deceptive and detecting deception for all sorts of good reasons. But it turns out when you can look at the text and not do it in real time, or at least not do it in human real time, then deception is fairly readily detectable. Here's how it works. If you are being deceptive, characteristically you will reduce the number of first-person singular pronouns that you use. Hypothesis, you're distancing yourself from what you're saying in some sense. You will reduce the number of exclusive words. These are words that introduce complicating sub-clauses and sub-phrasing, and you'll use less of those, hypothesis, because it complicates things and your brain can't keep up. Conversely, you will increase the number of negative emotion words that you use. Hypothesis, you feel bad about it because you know lying is socially inappropriate, and that leaks out into the language you use. And you will also increase the number of action verbs you use. Hypothesis, you're trying to keep the story moving so that people don't realize there might be holes in it. Okay, so this model's been developed empirically and validated across now very, very large populations. And so this means that if you have a cognate set of documents, you can rank them from most to least deceptive with fairly high credibility. You've got to be careful about the universe you're talking about, right? So if you have a mixture of different people, then that won't always work because it's not a single ranking, but still. And so here's an example from testimony to a Canadian Royal Commission equivalent. That line goes from most deceptive at the orange end to least deceptive at the purple end. The number 160 down there was the clerk of the court, who probably had very little reason to be deceptive. The high scorers at the left-hand end were people who did not know why they had been given certain jobs, didn't know who they reported to, didn't know how much they'd been paid or by whom. The typical kind of Royal Commission responses, I don't remember. And so, in fact, that turned out to be pretty good agreement with what was expected. So that's the kind of thing you can do, is you can take pools of responses like that and decide who might be being deceptive. Jihadist intensity, this is nice when you have lots of online forum postings and things of that sort, to try and figure out which ones you should care about. And so this is leveraged off a model that was developed by Koppel and Kiva of Salafist Jihadist language, originally in Arabic. We translated it into English using Google Translate, so that's pretty rough and ready. And there's some examples of the words that you get. And you can kind of see that some of those words are the ones you might have guessed would be relevant. But words like "oh," you see, are a kind of meta marker of a certain kind of religiosity, which in Western circles is sort of Book of Common Prayer type language, right? So that same kind of mindset in a way works in the jihadist universe. And if we take, for example, this forum, which was collected by Sinjin Chen's group at Arizona, and look at 100,000 posts, so that's more than you really want anyone to have to read through by hand, by eye. And it's a relatively difficult corpus in the sense that it's a mixture of English and Arabic phrases transliterated in multiple ways and some other languages mixed in, and lots of informal posts and stuff like that. And of course, it's a second language for many people posting, maybe a third language. And when you do this kind of analysis, you see that you actually get a pretty nice single-factored structure where the intense posts are on the left-hand end and the less intense posts are on the right-hand end. And the reason you get that kind of fishtail thing there is that these posts split into two different flavors, one of which is a sort of political Islamist flavor, and the other which is a kind of religious Islamist flavor. But you see that of all the 100,000 posts there, this picks out maybe the top 5,000 that you might want to have a human look at, and that all of a sudden becomes a scalable problem. So if you ask what are the words that make the difference, it's sort of interesting too, because it's not the ones that are kind of content-filled, it's the different rates at which pretty ordinary seeming words are actually used, and that's also characteristic of this space. It's not easy to separate this behavior from that behavior because they use these 5 words and they don't use these 5 words. It's because everybody uses all the common words, but they use them at different rates. And so that's why we don't pick it up very easily as humans, because we don't run tracking histograms of the word frequencies we've seen of all the common words as people speak to us. Now we can mix deception and jihadist intensity, and that's what this picture does. The plot is based on deception, so the deception intensity increases as you move to the left-hand end, and the reason that it's sort of fish-shaped again is that it actually has this two-part structure, one of which is derived mostly from the first-person pronouns and the other of which is derived from the exclusive words, but and all of those words like that. And I've overlaid this with the blue squares of the ones which were strongly jihadist in the previous plot. And you see that it's not perfect, but they are in fact inversely correlated. And what that tells you right away is that you're going to have a hard time if you try and set up fake jihadist postings to try and get to pick up who reads them, because at some level at least, people will detect that if they're deceptive, that they don't fit very well with the stronger jihadist and vice versa. So you do learn stuff by putting these models together. 3, financial fraud. Again, an empirical model derived from the management discussion and analysis sections of SEC filings. So public companies have to file these 4 times a year. They are the part of the standard filing which has the most flexibility. You can mostly say what you want in this section, and it's free-form text. And so this is the part where you get to puff what your business is doing in this quarter as much as you possibly can to try and increase investment and stock price and so on. Here's the top 20 words that are important for the difference between fraudulent and non-fraudulent MDNAs. Now, the SEC, in fact, issues statements that a particular report was fraudulent many, many, many moons after the report was actually issued, in some cases as long as 10 years later. But if you do prediction based on this kind of approach, we can get per report accuracy of 88%, agreement with the eventual SEC statements after the fact. Now also remember that the SEC is very conservative about which reports it says are fraudulent. So that comparison is not apples and apples, it's apples and quite conservative oranges, right? But still. And in fact, if you look at the sequence of reports, so here's one particular company that got a long sequence of fraudulent reports over 10 years, you see that it's not just that for this quarter we decide to be fraudulent and for next quarter we're back to being honest again. It's that there's a company process which slides over the border from strong advertising, if you like, into outright fraudulent language. And eventually somebody decides it's too much and pulls you back. So the red box is the reports which the SEC did after the fact claim were fraudulent. But you see that it's sort of compelling that actually that was pretty understated, and that at least the one afterwards and the couple before were pushing the boundary pretty tightly at least. Okay, so that 88% is probably an understatement of how well you would do if you wanted to decide how to spend your actual money. You would pull back from anybody who looked like they were being fraudulent, even if that happened to be too strong. And the puzzle, of course, with that result was that MD&As get written by some committee in the business, almost always, and sometimes not even the chief financial officer is on that committee. So how can that possibly work? So we did some experiments, and what we showed is that deception actually leaks through people. So if you get people and ask them to write an MD&A section, and you give them data from somebody who pretends to be the CFO, then if the CFO is lying, they will produce fraudulent MD&As that you can detect as fraudulent. And if the CFO is honest, then you produce honest reports. So this verbal mimicry thing is actually quite subtle, because it means that many of these properties can actually pass from person to person and still be detectable. At some level, that's not really surprising. You may know of Christakis' work, which shows, for example, that in social networks, your happiness is influenced not by your neighbors and your neighbors' neighbors, but by your neighbors' neighbors' neighbors. And that's people you probably don't even know. And there's lots of properties which flow across social networks that way. Right? So as humans, we are hugely mimicry machines. And so this can be very useful, but you always have to have that caveat in your mind. Am I seeing the property coming from this person, or am I actually seeing it transmitted from somebody further up the chain? Just to be a bit topical, we also looked at the language of influence using the US presidential elections with the eventual goal of understanding Islamist propaganda and things like that. But the thing about the US presidential elections is they are the most finely tuned and expensively resourced influence campaigns that we have in the world. And so if they are trying out everything that they could try. And in fact, it turns out that the winning strategy for the US presidency is relatively straightforward and even in a sense intuitive, but no politician can actually do it, at least to begin with. So here's the model. This is what you do to win. You use positive language. You completely wipe negative language from your vocabulary. You don't talk about policy because nobody cares, and they don't believe you're going to do it anyway. And you don't talk about the other candidate. So if you want to sum this up, you might say it's statesmanlike. Now, if you look at the most recent election, you see that Hillary Clinton didn't do any of those four things. Trump, however, did 2 out of 4. He actually used a lot of positive words. Make America great is a really appropriate statement for this kind of language. And he had no policy discussion, to which the media and the pundits excoriated him, but in fact that's exactly what you should do. And so this model predicts that Trump would have won. Indeed, I did predict that on Tuesday. And it's been right 6.5 times out of the 7 most recent presidential elections. The half comes because it predicted that Gore would beat Bush, but by a tiny, tiny margin. And you could argue that that's actually what happened. Okay. So here's the picture of all of the speeches given up until this most recent cycle. And so the model of language goes from the lower right to the upper left. And there's an interesting subdynamic, and that is that everyone who starts off in a campaign does terribly. They're all down to the bottom right. But once they've been president for a term and they come back for re-election, they move way up. Okay? And so this language model is not something that they learn, it's something that they develop because of their own self-image. In fact, we did some analysis of the speeches while they're president, and for every president we looked at, the transition's very fast. It happens within a month. It's a different month for different presidents. For some, it's immediately after inauguration. For others, it's as they begin their re-election campaign. But in both cases, they move from whatever they used the first time around to something much more like this model. And if you look carefully, you'll see that when you're running against an incumbent as the challenger, your language is actually pulled up by their language. So if somebody challenging an incumbent will use language much more like this than if there's 2 challengers in the same election cycle. Mimicry at work again, you see. So that's the forward engineering part, and that lets you get from sort of how does this work to analyzing large corpora of documents or speeches or whatever they are. But we can also think about the reverse engineering problem, and now it's something which lets us focus on individuals. Once you know how the process works forward, you can say, okay, if that's what came out, what was going on for that person who produced that particular document. So going back to authors again. And so the payoff from doing it this way is that you can focus on the people who are doing the whatever property you care about, right? So this person is lying, this person is a fraudster, this person is doing well at propaganda or is terrible at it, this person has jihadist opinions, this person is unusual. But there's also a second order component, and that is you can say, this person's language changed dramatically from what they said yesterday to what they said today. That's not random. Something happened inside their mind between those 2 days. What was it? And so, for example, in the US presidential elections, there's a couple of points at which the language usage changes dramatically over 1 day. You could say, they were blindsided by something that day, and indeed that's what happens. So just some of the obvious examples of this. Suppose I want to know who wrote some particular document or something that I have access to. And that's not an entirely simple problem, because you could mean any of these 3 different things. But let me focus on the third one, because that's now accurate enough that it's admissible in court in several jurisdictions in the US at least. And this is the situation where somebody sends a hate-filled email, and when they get called on it, they say, oh, I left my computer on when I went to lunch. And in that situation, it's been in fact used to prove that no, they didn't. They actually did send the email, because the language of that hate-filled email matches the language of the other emails that they send. So that's the kind of thing you can do with authorship. But just notice that what we call a parody is something which sounds to us as humans like it was written by some other author, but it matches in the content channel and not in the internal state channel. This is also something that's kind of useful if you have posts by a particular inflammatory preacher or something like that. You might want to get some idea of their personality. And so this work by Penny, Baker, and Chung looked at how you can work out their personality dimensions based on their use of adjectives. This is not a perfect match to the big five that you may be familiar with, but it's not all that terribly far from it either. You can also determine how well somebody is feeling by their posts. And this is interesting because it's actually a second order effect. It's not that there are particular words that you use when you're feeling good and other words you use when you're feeling crook. It's that people who are feeling good have much more variability in their word use from one moment to the next and one day to the next. Whereas people who are not feeling well tend to use the same words over and over and over again. So that's just sort of interesting. And you can also pick up status in dialogues. And this one is the opposite of what most people will guess. And that is that the person who uses the most first-person singular pronouns is typically the lowest status person in that dialogue. So we tend to think people who say I a lot are being very egotistical, but in fact it's exactly the opposite of that dialogue. And here's some work on jihadist propaganda. So there's 3 different English language glossy magazines that are put out by Islamist groups. Inspire, put out by AQAP, Dabiq, put out by Daesh, Azan, put out by the Taliban. And when we do an analysis of the word use of those magazines, you can see that they're actually quite different to each other. Points labeled IN are Inspire, they're mostly on the left-hand side of the picture. Dabiq is to the top right, and Azan is to the bottom right. And if you look carefully, some of you may be able to see there's some Inspires mixed in the middle of the word cloud. So right away we know that Dabiq and Azan are much more focused in terms of their content, whereas Inspire tends to wander around the space of possible things to talk about much more than the other 2. But we can also look at the words which are sort of pulled towards those magazines and see what they're focusing on. And so you see, for example, that Inspire tends to have enemy in America pulled towards it. Azan has paradise, and Dabiq has Islamic and slave, and words like Iraq, words like that. So we can get some sense of what their focus is from doing this kind of analysis. And if we look at the time sequence, we can get some idea of how the jihadist intensity is changing using the model that I showed you before. So here's the sequence for Inspire for the first 12 issues, and you see that the first 8, relatively speaking, hang around in the same space, but after the death of Anwar al-Awlaki, you see this big jump where you suddenly move far to the left, and so you see the jihadist intensity increasing quite strongly at that point, and with a little sort of hop step through 9 on the way. So you can, that's what I meant by saying, when things change, you can ask the question, why has it changed? In this case, we can see clearly why it did. So the technical stuff for those who hear about it, the lying behind all of this is sort of standard bag of words analysis, and it remains surprising that that is actually as effective as it is, right? Because the dog bit the man and the man bit the dog are quite different sentences in English, but they have exactly the same bag of words. And so you'd be surprised that the whole Google search mechanism and so on works as well as it does. But it's clearly not really enough. And so the kind of cutting edge at the moment is to figure out what's the next abstraction that you might want to use that will give you a little bit more insight into what's happening in the language, preserve some of that deeper structure, and here things like systemic functional nets or skipgrams are the places where people are starting to look for that stuff. And so the standard bag of words approach produces a document versus words matrix, which you can then analyze. Systemic functional nets produces a document versus choice matrix. And that's a choice which is a greater granularity than just the choice of a particular word. So that's upping the level of abstraction a bit. And then the skip-gam approach gives you a document concept matrix, which is a little bit orthogonal to the previous one, but it certainly, again, lets you say these words somehow belong together, and the choice between these words is an irrelevant choice for the purposes of trying to understand what's going on. And you could say LDA is a little bit like that. And then when you have these matrices, then the rows are the documents. And so what you want to do is you want to understand the relationships among the documents. And for that you need some kind of clustering. And the pictures that I've shown you have been driven by singular value decomposition, but it's also turning out to be interesting to use deep learning techniques to try and do a little bit better on the clustering side as well. So, in summary, the benefit of language is that on the way from idea to utterance, it stops at many places in your brain, and as it does that, it picks up aspects of what's going on in your brain at the time. And so we can leverage that in these two directions. The first direction is what's going on. How is the leakage working for this particular property of the documents that we want to talk about? And so that gives us the global picture of how a particular property sort of happens. You know, what is it that leads to deception? What is it that leads to this? And the list I gave you is just a list. You can extend this approach to other properties as long as you can find a way to build an empirical model to get yourself started. Once you have that empirical model, now you can leverage that to do analysis of entire sets of documents, which may be very large in some cases, and that's really in some ways where the win is. And once you've got that model applied to that set of documents, you can use it to select the interesting, important, significant subset of those documents for which you can use cleverer techniques, including humans, to look at them if you really want to. And once all that's in place, then you can start asking the questions in reverse, and that is, you know, what makes these two documents by these two authors similar or different, and what does that say about those individuals? And if they're by the same individual at different times, what changed that caused them to use this language differently? Because you know that those language models are subconscious, and therefore it isn't that they decided to fake you out today and they forgot to do that yesterday. Something is changing and in their subconscious mind, and that's almost always going to be interesting. And so there's a huge amount of practical payoff from following this approach. So I hope that's stimulated you to think about ways in which language flows into your life and how language flows out of you and what that might mean, and that there might be some interesting payoffs for you in that space. So let me stop there. Thanks, Tony, for organizing this, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, I'm just going to stop the YouTube video for a minute, type in questions and restart it again. Eugene, if you'd like to come up to the front. Warrior, if you can, I've got to get I think it's, Tyson, do you remember what it is to take it off mute? I think it might be ***, but I'm not 100% sure.